We're in the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, and I'm a partnerships manager here at AllVoices, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. Today, I am very excited to welcome our next guest, Lars Schmidt. Amongst many things, he is an entrepreneur and founder of Redefining HR Accelerator. Lars, how are you?
Yeah, it's good to be here, Christina. I appreciate you having me on. And just for viewers, my pronouns are he and him.
Amazing. Well, can you start off by telling us a little bit about, yourself and what did you want to be when you were younger?
Oh, wow. Let's see. When I was younger, like an astronaut initially, like
Amazing.
most kids. I grew up in South Florida. And so I grew up, a couple hundred miles from Cape Canaveral. We watched all the space shuttles take off. And so I was kind of enamored with space from an early age. I think as I got a little older, that evolved to being an actor. I wanted to be an actor for a little while and then a talk show host. So yeah, interestingly. In some ways, I'm kind of indulging, I think, that talk show host with my podcast, other programs. But yeah, about me, I'm a dad. I've got two girls. I'm a husband. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm an author, podcaster. I do a lot of stuff, and the bio is a little overly lengthy and embarrassing to get into, but really I'm drawn to projects that accelerate innovation in HR and people operations and accelerate kind of modern practices in those fields. So whether it's, HR open source, whether it's the Redefining HR book or podcast, Fast Company, like all those projects are aimed at that same mission, which is really kind of helping raise our collective capabilities in the field.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of room for innovation in a lot of fields, but especially HR. I know traditionally when folks think of HR, they think of, human resources on behalf of the company and maybe in the best interest of the organization. And there is that kind of, you need to build up that trust with folks within the department. And, they might think of worst case scenarios, but what do you think people should think of as we're redefining the space? What do you hope that employees, especially who aren't in HR, think about the department?
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I think that there's, it's somewhat of a false choice that HR, and perhaps even kind of in the legacy view of HR, that HR had to be, on the side of the company, and that meant they could not be on the side of the employees, right? And I think that obviously the function of HR is an organizational function, but the effective leaders in that areas, they find ways to be able to represent and advocate on behalf of both. It's a false choice to say like you've got to do one or the other and they're direct conflict. Like hopefully they're not in conflict, right? Like hopefully you could create programs that benefit both the company and the employees. So I think when you look at modern people teams, they find ways to do that, and they build the trust of their employees, and they're able to really be a sounding board at the executive level about whether it's decisions around benefits or navigating a global pandemic, crazy things like that we've actually experienced in the last year. So yeah, I think that is a bit of a shift. I think if you look at those best in class teams, they're able, and it's not always easy. I don't want to portray it as if it is, and there's some scenarios where there is a clear conflict, but for the most part, I think modern HR operators see their role as representing and supporting the best interests of both of those entities, and hopefully in those organizations, those employees feel that they have that trust.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there is a lot of pressure on kind of leaders and operators, especially now with the global pandemic and just everything that is going on in the world, to really be flexible and adaptable. One of the things I also wanted to ask you too was about kind of progressive leadership. And I know you talk a lot about this in the book and cite specific folks, but how do you kind of generally define a progressive people leader in today's world?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a hard job. I've said this tons of times. I feel like a broken record at this point, but I think next to the CEO, the CPO, CHRO is the most difficult job in the C-suite. And the reason is because you have to, today's modern CHRO, especially those high performing teams, you have to understand the business first and foremost. Like in the old days, like you had to have deep HR acumen, but now you need that and the business acumen. You have to understand the go-to-market strategy. You have to understand the revenue models. You have to understand the 3-year plan. You have to understand the financials. You have to understand the impediments to the business and the technology roadmap. And then with that understanding, you have to distill all of that into a people strategy that supports all of those things. And that's really hard. So they possess that business acumen. I think that's really important. They're comfortable with a lot of the modern, the way a lot of the modern pillars of modern HR, whether it's how we think about DEI, or how we leverage people analytics, or how we build flexible programs and more agile type approaches than those traditional playbook oriented approaches of the past. Those are all capabilities that they possess as well. Another thing is I think that they're relatable. And what I mean by that is I think, old school HR leaders have this kind of buttoned up persona, this kind of archetype of infallibility. And we all know that's not real. None of us are perfect. And I think if you look at some of the best in class CHROs and CPOs are out there, they're humble, they're vulnerable, they're real, they're compassionate, but they're also comfortable, in some cases talking about what they don't know and mistakes they've made and things like that. And I think that all of those things make them more relatable to their teams and allows them to actually, connect with their teams and roles that those legacy predecessors just couldn't.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, nobody is perfect. Everybody's on their own journey, but a big part of it is being humble and vulnerable, and really honest with yourself. I know you mentioned a couple of folks you've worked with or just seen in the space, but is there anyone that you wanted to kind of shout out that's top of mind who is a really progressive people leader leading into the work?
I almost feel like I'm a hype person for these people now because I've been doing I get this question a lot, but I'm a huge fan of Katarina Berg at Spotify. I'm a huge fan of Katie Burke at HubSpot. I'm a big fan of David Hanrahan at Eventbrite. There's a lot of them, out there, and Anna Binder at Asana, Caitlin Holloway, she's not an operator anymore. She's moved over to venture capital, but she's certainly somebody that I look to. AJ Thomas over at X, the Moonshot Factory out of Alphabet, phenomenal. So I like the fact that when I've asked that question, I actually have a lot of answers because there's so many people doing really good work right now. Lena Nair at Unilever. I mean, it's a long and growing list, which is great for the field.
You are like their hype man over here. You have like the
I know, right?
Names like, ready to go.
I'm gonna have a sponsored T-shirt at some point with just like logos, their logos that I'll be rocking when I'm doing these podcasts.
Oh my God, I'm sure they appreciate it.
Yeah, well, they earned it. They're not asking for it, and they probably would, certainly, they let their work speak for themselves. So it's just a bonus to be a hype man. It's a pleasure to be able to point people their way because they're doing really good work.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we definitely appreciate kind of those examples too, of like what it looks like in practice. One of the things that you also mentioned was just HR can't be siloed into one part of the business. They need to know all of these different things in terms of strategies and planning. And I know in your book, Redefining HR, one of the first things that you talk about is really addressing diversity, equity, and inclusion, since there is a focus on building an equitable workplace. And you talk about really building in and committing to anti-racist agendas. In your kind of opinion, in your research of doing this and all of your experience, what does that kind of really look like in practice in committing to these anti-racist agendas?
Yeah, I mean, look, I before I even answer, I have to kind of own that, like, I am a middle-aged cisgender, able white man. So I'm certainly not the spokesperson for how to do that effectively. I am the spokesperson for the people who are often in positions of power in organizations who need to be doing this work. And so I'll come at that answer more from that point of view. I think, in the older days of HR of Yorn, we looked at it purely from a diversity standpoint, and we often looked at diversity purely from a recruiting perspective. I think when you look at these best in class organizations, it's not just that our vocabulary has expanded, but we're really thinking about building inclusive organizations and building equity and representation throughout all of the aspects of our HR and people operations. And I think if you look at, some of the recent statistics on the field, at least in North America, we're heavily dominated by women as well. And so I think having the
Lars, can you hear me? It's frozen.
Agenda. Oh, sorry. Did I lose you a bit?
Yeah, lost you for a second. The last thing I heard was we're heavily dominated by women.
Okay, cool. So yeah, hopefully you've got some editing chops on the back end.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Sorry for the Wi-Fi. So do you want me to take it from the top or just take it from there?
You could take it from there.
Okay. So with those being the demographics, I think, we really have to focus internally as HR operators to be able to build inclusive organizations and or anti-racist organizations. And I think there's only a handful of companies that are publicly committed to an anti-racist agenda, and they have specific milestones and steps and actions that they're taking in order for them to get there. A couple would be Culture Amp, Peloton, Smart Recruiters. But I think in terms of just building an organization that's truly committed to being an inclusive employer, having equity and representation within the organization, actually being able to identify and dismantle systemic systems that produce disproportionate outcomes. To do all those things, especially in a field that is, by all accounts, 70% white, it starts with us. And that's why, my initial analogy is, I'm not the best person to be talking about equity based on my background. I am the best person to be listening to this conversation because, I think for a field that's 70% white, we have to do this work, this, education, this kind of anti-racist work and learning at an individual level before we can really look at doing that thoughtfully at an organizational level. Because if we haven't done this work, we have all kinds of blind spots. And to start to say, okay, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, those might not be the right things. And if you're not making those decisions from the foundation of education and understanding, you're very likely to go off in the wrong direction. So I think that it's hugely important. And it also is something that is not, it doesn't end, right? I think you have to, whether at an organizational level or as an individual level, if you're committed to this work, you're committed to this work on the daily. It can't just be something where it's like, okay, this quarter, we're going to focus on this, and then we're going to move our OKRs over here. It's like, you have to be in this and you have to stay in this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I definitely agree with you in terms of your point of view and just your role and experience in the space and being a leader and someone who, it's a different type of work, right? For people who are people of color in the space who are just entering the workforce as well. It's just, we're all at a different part of our learning journey. But one of the things that you kind of personally committed to as well was the Amplify Black Voices in HR spreadsheet. I checked it out, or just like database or resource. How did you think about kind of using your platform to really amplify Black voices in HR?
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, like, especially in May of 2020, after George Floyd's murder and the heightened conversation around racism and social justice and inequity, like a lot of people, hopefully, I did a lot of introspection on myself and examining of my own kind of behaviors. And I think particularly as I looked at some of these systemic issues in our field, I realized, and I'd never really thought about this until those moments, that I was absolutely the beneficiary of a lot of these systems. I was, asked to write for different publications. I was often asked to speak and go on stage. I was often asked to go on podcasts like this. And, for me personally, that was great. But at that moment, I thought more about, I'm taking up a lot of space. And am I doing enough to lift other voices and individuals with me? Like, if I have this position and I have this, this editorial access, and I have conference organizer access, what am I doing with that other than just personally, benefiting from it? And I really had to take a hard look and realize that I was kind of part of the problem, to be honest with you. I was one of those people who benefited from all those systems and wasn't using my platform in a way to lift others up in a conscious and proactive way. And so that's what led to that, open source document. And, one of the things I did as well is I have, through my editor at Fast Company and a few other publications, I reached out and made a lot of introductions and recommendations from, Black and other BIPOC contributors to help diversify their sources. And I was able to get a couple people contributing from my network to Fast Company, and obviously through the Amplifying Black Voices open source doc, get people speaking gigs, and again, pushing organizers to actually pay them as well, which I think is hugely important. So I think really that was kind of the background for me. It was examining my own, privilege and the benefits that I had received from that, and feeling that, if I'm in this position, it's my obligation to try to do something with that lifts others up. And yeah, that's how I landed there.
I think that's so important. And I think that is really great and goes back to your earlier point too about being humble and, having that growth mindset as well about what we can always be doing to be better people and what we can do with our experience platform and just the space that we hold as well. One of the questions I also wanted to ask too was we found that, people really resonate with stories that we tell on this podcast too. So I wanted to see if you're like in your 20 years of experience, 20 plus years experience in HR, can you share maybe like a risk you took as a progressive people leader for your strategy and for the organization that yielded an ideal or better result?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've probably done a lot of those. I can also talk about a lot of things that yielded not better results and blew up. I mean, I think when you are trying things, and I have a very experimental approach where I'm quick to try things and I'm quick to move away from them if they don't work and lean into them if they do. I think that rapid kind of experiment and pilot and iterate mindset has been foundational for me in my career, and more things have paid off than didn't, but I've certainly made tons of mistakes. I think the thing that comes to mind is, when I joined NPR to run, I was joined in 2011, kind of right when they were moving from radio and broadcast to digital. I had, I just come from, running recruiting in a bunch of other areas at Ticketmaster. So I was used to big, budgets, teams, resources. Right. I had none of that in NPR. It was, no budget, no resources, no teams. And I was always a big social media fan. And so I was like, what if we, and this was kind of in the early days of employer branding, or I should say the digital iteration of employer branding.
Right.
And I was like, well, what if we create a hashtag and, we encourage employees to share their experience. And so and that's kind of how NPR Life was born, which I think was the first, if not one of the first culture hashtags that is now kind of become default. But I still remember I was at the pitch meeting with our head of comms, and the week that I pitched this was like a week after there was that James O'Keefe sting on Vivian Schiller and Ron Schiller, and Vivian was ousted as our CEO, and Juan Williams, we had a big falling out publicly with him, and so obviously we were under the radar and facing a lot of scrutiny publicly. And so when I pitched the idea of NPR Life, I said, hey, I'm gonna roll this out to everybody, and it'll be a big thing, and everybody will be tweeting and sharing what it's like to work here. And they were like, no effing way. Like, are you serious? Like in this environment? And I was like, okay. I have a better idea. Like, I understand your hesitation. I recognize that. I understand the climate we're in. I was like, let me pilot it. Let me just get a handful of people and just pilot it and see what happens. We'll see if it works. And, so I did that. I had a couple of journalists that I was friends with, and I had them engaging on it. And Peter Sagal, the host of Wait, about a week after we started piloting it, tweeted, it's 10:30 in the morning and I'm already half drunk on surplus car talk mugs, NPR Life. And that tweet went viral. And that's kind of how NPR Life, technically it never really left pilot phase, but at that moment it blew up, and then everybody within NPR started using it and they gained a lot of traction. But that was a fun pilot that became something different that almost didn't. So
that's great. I mean, that's an amazing story, but I do need to ask now about one of the mistakes that you kind of made as well, which comes to mind of like when you took a risk and it wasn't the ideal result.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think at the beginning of the pandemic, I made a tweak to my podcast, which at the time was 21st Century HR. And I thought, hey, we're all home. Everybody's sheltering. I'm going to change the format. Instead of making it an audio podcast, I'll make it a live video show. And it'll be a weekly live video show from 12 to 1 Eastern, Monday through Friday, 5 days a week.
Like a talk show.
Going back to that talk show host.
Yeah.
And nobody watched. Nobody watched. I think I did it for 3 weeks. I did like 15 episodes, and it was really just, I had my friends on. And so it was us kind of, nerding out, but like nobody watched. Like it completely bombed, and I scrapped it after a month. But yeah, I was like, sure, everybody's home. This will be great. Like everybody's gonna, it's a captive audience. But nobody gave a damn. Nobody watched, and I quickly sunsetted that project and moved back to audio only.
Yeah, there we go. It's always like moving and grooving and changing based on that in a humbling moment,
Yeah. Hey, that's if you're not taking risks and trying things, if you're afraid of failure, you're never going to get that far. So I don't fear that at all, and I have the scars to prove it.
There you go. There you go. Have you, in terms of the book that you wrote and redefining HR, have you received any pushback for like hot takes that you have on where HR is going and just I know it's like a very kind of the future of like where this industry will go in the future, and it is different than where it was in the past, like we were talking about. So I
Yeah.
also wanted to ask, how has that been received in the market?
Yeah, I mean, I think overall it's been received incredibly well. I think
Yeah.
if I get any criticism, which is fair, it's that a lot of the case studies and the essays and the examples do lean tech, because that's a big part of my network, which I own in the introduction. I say,
Yeah.
hey, look, the field of HR is too broad. I don't get into nonprofit. I don't get into manufacturing. I don't get into some of these other industries, and those are great industries and they're doing great work. But that's
Right.
just not, those stories aren't necessarily going to show up in this book.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think some people perceive that tech, because it's tech, they have the ability to do innovative things that traditional industries don't. And I challenge that assertion because I think that innovative work is happening all over the place. I think tech gets the limelight because, we're all smitten with the Googles and the Amazons of the world. But great work happens everywhere. And you don't have to have a marquee blue chip, name to be doing good work. And so, yeah, I think that's the criticism that came up. I think, for some people that maybe are slow to the current conversation around DEI, that chapter came in hot for some people. I think
Mhm.
some people were taken a bit aback. My editor actually softened some of my framing on that during the review process,
Oh,
because I
really?
think,
Okay.
it was also like I wrote it. I started writing it before George Floyd's murder, but I really
Mhm.
wrote it in earnest and rewrote it
Yeah.
after the murder. And so I was, it reflected a lot of my thinking at that time, and also my personal evolution. As I mentioned before, like some of the things that I was learning and going, and I was reading books, and I was really, and I kind of saw this as being one of the imperatives of modern HR, that we really have to embrace this fully. And it's not an optional thing. Like if you want to build modern HR teams, it's foundational. You have to be able to think about these things. You have to be able to incorporate some of these practices into your organization. And so I think, again, for practitioners that maybe, as I mentioned, kind of like diversity, equity, they're still in that diversity camp. That may have been a lot for them to absorb, because I think, even going back to, like, let's say, for example, white fragility, it makes people a little uncomfortable to
Right.
realize the work that they have to do to be able to operate at that level. And I mean, there's some people that are hearing, they're still kind of reacting and recoiling from the term white privilege, or even white supremacy, because they don't necessarily understand. They have their own assumption of what that means,
Right.
but they don't. But it's not what it actually means, and they haven't done that work yet. So without that, I think that chapter for some people it came in a little hot.
Yeah, I think that definitely makes sense. And that's interesting too, that people, I don't know, are expressing this to you and just you wrote it and it was like edited down. I think that's interesting too. And I think related to kind of the conversation around corporate social justice, the pandemic, the caregiving crisis, mental health crisis, everything that's
Yeah.
going on, managers have and people, leaders who are, responsible for a lot right now, their roles are changing. Do you think that they have a new responsibility to really be vulnerable and just, I mean, we're in each other's homes right now, and managers might not meet the people that they're responsible for? How do you see that kind of changing in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'll key on vulnerable for a moment, because I think, we talk about that a lot. It's kind of a hot topic of conversation in the HR space.
Buzzword.
Yeah, like I think that I do think vulnerability is an important trait of leadership. I don't think it is a required trait. And what I mean by that is, like, if, everybody, I would much rather everybody be comfortable and operate externally as they feel internally. And for some of
Mhm.
them, that is being an open book and being vulnerable and sharing all of their highs and lows and everything else.
Right.
For others, it's not. They're personally more reserved, more private. Maybe they're an introvert. Doesn't really matter if they're an introvert or not. They're just not as
Yeah.
comfortable sharing that. Those people shouldn't feel obligated to be, vulnerable. Those people shouldn't feel obligated. We shouldn't put pressure on those people to, like, tell me the worst part of your day today, right? Because that's not allowing them to be true to who they are. And so I
Right.
do think it is an important trait. I do think it helps leaders, whether HR leaders or otherwise, connect to their teams and relate in a bit more way. But I think we have to be careful with how we lean in on this, that we're not necessarily pushing people towards that if that's not authentically true to who they are.
Okay, I think that's definitely fair. This goes along the lines of a lot of folks are also talking about bringing your full self to work. True or false? Do you believe that people should and can bring their full selves to work?
I think they should bring the full selves they're comfortable bringing to work. Kind of going back to that last part, like your full self, unless you're a jerk, leave the jerk part of you at home. Let's assume you're not. Like, I think we have to create spaces where people feel comfortable showing up in the ways they want to show up. And for some of that, that's going to be their whole selves. For others, that's not, and that's okay. We shouldn't push people towards something that is not natural for them. And so I think, we crave, like, the utopia of an organization is building a place of belonging, right? You can't create a place of belonging if you're forcing them to be a certain way, no matter how that way is. And so I think that's really important. If we want to build those types of organizations, it's about creating a safe space where people feel welcome and they belong in the ways that they choose to show up. But choice is really the essential term there.
I think that's really important to highlight too, choice. I think that's often left out of the conversation, and bringing your full self to work and who you're talking about and who is on your team and who you're hiring, and all of that good stuff. One of the questions that I also wanted to ask you was, what is a question that stands out either in the interview process when you were an interviewer, so hiring someone on your team, or that you have been asked when someone was interviewing you to be on their team?
Yeah. I mean, my favorite interview question, and actually was the name of my very first podcast, like way back in the day, was, what's the best part of your job? And for me, I think that answer is so illuminating because it may be specific to the deliverables of their work. It might be to the culture. It might be to the flexibility of the job. It might, you don't know what it's going to be, but it illuminates what's really important to that candidate. And it helps me as a recruiter understand how what I'm representing aligns or doesn't, with that big driver of yours. So it's a question that gets you a little bit out of the traditional, interview mode. It's certainly not like, what are your strengths or where do you see yourself in 5 years?
Yeah.
Like, please don't ask that question. But I think for me, it's very telling. And actually, it led to a podcast that the very first podcast I had where I interviewed people in different careers to ask about what it's like to do that job, from like shark marine biologists to the guy who played Chunk in the Goonies, to a range of other guests. So that was a lot of fun.
That's awesome. Do you remember a question that you have been asked in the interview process, or when someone was vetting you for a job, that you were like, oh, that's a good question nobody's asked me before?
I haven't interviewed in a very long time, to be honest with you. So nothing profound comes to mind, to be honest.
That's fair. That's fair. Who is someone that recently inspired you?
Wow. Honestly, my wife.
That's a great answer.
She is, yeah. Well, I mean, so we're sheltering here. We pulled our oldest daughter is in first grade. We pulled her out of school at the beginning of the year to enroll her in a virtual academy. So my wife, is not working right now. So she basically became her teacher. And last week was Teacher Appreciation Week, and it just made me like, she has a background that isn't at all in teaching, but the fact that she's been able to do this successfully, and our daughters have, under the circumstances, have really thrived. That is just a testament to her, but I think also a testament to like so many parents out there who are having to, navigate these weird weathers and like, have a job and like homeschool your kids and maybe take care of elder care for parents, or whatever it might be. I think we're under such harsh circumstances. So to be able to see how as humans we can adapt to that, and obviously having a front row seat to that in my house has been pretty inspiring.
Yeah, absolutely. I think teachers and a lot of folks who are responsible for just teaching in general are definitely unsung heroes oftentimes. And now you have a full-time job, you're a teacher. Caregiving is a huge conversation that we talk about as well. Do you see that organizations are in a unique place to offer more benefits for caregiving and just like open up more flexible work, even when we are fully vaccinated and things like that?
Yeah, I do. Look, I think I always cringe when I use the term future work, because I usually use it in jest, because the term to me, it's like, it's now, like it's here, let's talk about the future, but like, it's flexible. It is flexible. I think we've, for many of us who had been commuting into an office 5 days a week for decades, now we haven't. We're like, my God, why did I do that? Like, I never want to do that again. And like, and for those of us who've been home and we've had all this extra time with our kids, and for people maybe who had jobs that they used to travel a lot, now they're not traveling. Some are itching to travel again, which I get, but like, I think many of them certainly don't want to travel at the same level that they did before, because that family time is something that is of increased importance to them. And so I think that, as an HR field, we're going to have to be a lot more flexible with how we think about supporting employees and benefits and hours. And it's such a fascinating time. Like all these industrial era concepts of work have been blown up by the pandemic, right? Like, work has to happen in an office. Work happens 9 to 5. Like, work happens Monday through Friday. No, it doesn't have to happen that way. And we can be really successful not having those be the way that we try to box, work in. So I think that we're just getting started. I'm hugely excited about the potential for just creating, incredibly differentiated, work experiences for our field, in HR, but also for our employees.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a huge opportunity in especially major challenges like a global pandemic, to really think about, how we're spending our time, how we're promoting our teams, and what benefits we offer as an organization. Are there any trends in HR that we haven't discussed here today that you think individuals and companies really need to take a look at in order to be successful in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the biggest thing is flexibility. We HR as a default, we're used to kind of playbooks. We're used to, like, these are systems of how we think about comp and benefits. These are systems of how we think about employee benefits and wellness support, how we think about compensation, right? I think all those things are changing. And we're also realizing that we're in this environment now where, like, our employees want a choice. And like, nowhere is that more clear than the shift towards hybrid and remote work. Like, that is a seismic shift for how many organizations operated for decades. And this is happening now. And so I think, we are in for this, period of reinvention, of creativity. And I'm so excited. I feel really fortunate that I have this kind of perch on the industry, where through the podcast and other editorial projects and just my network, I'm able to get a bird's eye view and and then a deep dive into some of these different practices. And so I'm just so excited about the future that we can create, because this is really our opportunity to create this new future. In some organizations, they're going to try to revert back to old ways, but in many organizations, they're going to build something that doesn't exist today. And that's really exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a huge opportunity to build tomorrow. I am going to take one of your questions from the podcast and ask what your least favorite HR term is.
Oh, wow. I'm probably guilty of using most of them. I always laugh. I asked that question. I think I asked that question of one guest, and like, I literally had used her least favorite buzzword, like the statement before.
I've
I
probably
came
used
in.
one of
So
yours before. So
yeah, like, I don't know. I think, in some ways, empathy, and I'm not a hater of empathy. I'm a supporter of empathy, but I think we misuse it all
okay.
the time. I think it's become a buzzword that we just throw out without really contextualizing it, and using it in the proper way. So I don't dislike that buzzword, but I do think that that we're not using it correctly in many of the use cases when we talk about it. And so I would probably cite that.
How would you like HR professionals and just folks to use the word empathy?
I think empathy, we often kind of mix compassion and empathy, right? I think we use those interchangeably. Well, we actually don't. We use empathy when we should be using compassion,
Mhm.
in a lot of ways. And I think that for HR leaders, like, empathy is to really put ourselves in another person's shoes to truly understand and relate and connect with their experience. And it's intentional, and it's deliberate, and it's thoughtful, or it's more of an action that I'm taking to be able to empathize with you. Whereas most times we use it, we're really being compassionate. Like, I'm trying to understand, like, this is difficult for you. I can't relate to it because I'm not experiencing it, but I can see that you are. and I honor that. I recognize that, right? Like that's being compassionate. That's not really being empathetic. And I think that we tend to use empathy in both of those scenarios.
I think that's interesting. I think words are very important too. So I don't know how you express yourself always comes up in these kind of conversations. So always like to ask and wanted to ask specifically since I heard you ask a guest on your podcast as well. Is there anything else that you want to share for the folks that are listening who are in HR, who are employees at a company, who also definitely want to get in touch with you? Maybe the book really resonated with them as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think that very concept is kind of what steered me to what I'm doing now, which is the podcast. When looking back, it all kind of, it's easy to connect the dots. Like I don't think I would
Hindsight
have
is
done that in the
2020.
beginning. Yeah, so it's like, the Fast Company series led to the podcast led to the book. The book has now led to this new Accelerator platform that I've launched to basically help develop and support the next generation of chief people officers. I get a lot of feedback from people who read the book. We're like, I've read this. I'm inspired. I want to, I want to kind of grow in these areas. Where can you point me? And I didn't have a good answer, to be honest. I was like, I could tell you a lot of things.
Good question.
But I don't. And so I was like, so why don't I build this? And so really the Accelerator is, there's a couple components. It's the book and the podcast, obviously. But it's a cohort program where, I'm actually launching my first cohort this week. Where it'll be groups of 50 students, people who are, now kind of HR leaders, people probably likely aspiring to be CHROs and CPOs, but it's a deep, kind of immersive experience in both learning from modern HR practices, but also community and network equity. So it's a way to kind of instantly build a peer network of 50 people who have similar views and interests as you do. So there's that component. There'll be on-demand courses that I'll be developing over time. And then in June, I'm launching a new newsletter and community bundle as well to create a space for these modern operators to come together and learn and accelerate their own capabilities. So yeah, I would say that, and all that is housed on redefininghr.com. So if you're curious, you can go there and you can see the next cohort will be in July. So I'll have details on that, and you can get details on the community newsletter and courses and everything else.
Amazing. And we'll include some of these links as well, or all of the links in the show notes too, so people can check it out. My last question for you is, if you could choose your legacy, what would you want folks to say about Lars Schmidt?
Oh, wow. I think that he, he cared about our field and he helped us get better. I think that, this idea of, it's so weird. Like when the terms like being like my orientation has always to try to be helpful and to be of service, right? Like I want to be able to, and that, I'm not saying that like this girl, look at how helpful I am, but like I'm where I am because people invested in me. I had great mentors, I had great teachers, I had great friends who were all generous at their time, and I wouldn't be where I am without their help. And so for me, again, I kind of mentioned this in the intro. Yeah, I do a lot of things and I have a lot of titles, but like at my core, my aim is to accelerate capabilities in HR at scale, accelerate innovation and progress in HR at scale, because I think that, there's a whole generation of HR leaders who certainly don't self-identify with a lot of those legacy stereotypes.
Right.
And I want to help them continue to build that momentum and that trajectory. And so I think if it's a legacy, hopefully that I did that, and I cared about the people that I worked with, and I think that in a more eloquent way, like that would fit. That would be very eloquent for a tombstone, but something like that, where it was somebody that was that cared and was helpful and was kind.
Well, from my point of view, you're doing a lot in this space, so you're fulfilling that legacy. But thank you so much, Lars Schmidt. I really appreciate you being on the podcast.
Yeah, I appreciate having me on. This is a lot of fun.
Yeah, absolutely. And to our listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. And as a reminder, at AllVoices, we believe in the empowerment of everyone in an organization to speak up and believe that it's a requirement to succeed. Speak soon.